Súla dosamid, ba bhfuil an fáir beag íoríara. Tá méid déanamh mo dhíthil míle sínteasóir a bhaint amach. Uair a tá tharbheith tábhachtach damsa. Clicéil ar an gnáth leachtáil, don cenéal le de cháil. I lán ach cricéal amháin ach is spreagag olivóir do mé chun tuile físeán a dhéanamh. Go raibh míle mágah. Hello everyone and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring figures from the past to life and talk about their history. Today we're talking about the first President of the United States, George Washington. There are only a few men that can claim to have lived as important of a life as he. We'll talk about his life, the events that formed him into a leader, and then reveal what he may have looked like in real life. So let's go ahead and get started. The roots of the Washington family reach back to the very early days of the American colonies. George's great-grandfather, John Washington, arrived in colonial Virginia in a very dramatic fashion. Shipwrecked on a merchant vessel en route to Europe, he decided to stay and make a new life for himself in the colonies. By the time John died 20 years later, he had become one of the richest men in Virginia, with over 8,000 acres of land and several tobacco plantations. The Washington family and everything it would become came from John Washington and his wrecked ship. A little more than 50 years later, George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. George would be raised with his older half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine Jr., who were born from his father's late first wife. While the older boys were sent off to formal school in England, George, as the third son, would be sent to the local church school instead. George would spend his formative years learning practical things like reading, writing, math and map-making. But in 1743, when George was 12, his father Augustine died, leaving him in the care of his eldest half-brother, Lawrence Washington. Lawrence had become a soldier and had been away for long periods of time during George's youth. But now he was set to inherit most of the Washington estate and would be responsible for George's upbringing. Luckily, Lawrence was a kind and wise man. Not only did he take care of George, but he would become the father figure that he knew George needed. Over the course of the next few years, George would accompany his brother everywhere he went, and he became obsessed with the charm, grace, and wit that important men and women like his brothers seemed to possess. George wanted to be just like his brother and began to dedicate himself to the art of becoming the perfect gentleman. According to Tim Ott's article on Washington, George knew that people would think less of him for being schooled in the colonies, but he didn't care. He began to write things down taught to him by the men that Lawrence surrounded himself with. This notebook would become a set of rules that Washington created for himself, called the Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. In it are things you'd expect, like treat others with respect and always try to do what's right. But he also had rules like always smile unless something's really serious, or don't bum people out when they're having fun. This dedication to becoming the perfect gentleman would form a fundamental piece of Washington's personality. He was really able to recognize his own faults, but never let them stop him from growing into a better man. By the time George was just 16, he was tall and athletic, towering over his contemporaries. At 6 feet 2, he was impeccably dressed and just as much a gentleman as his older brothers. But it was time for him to find a job, and that year he decided that he would become a land surveyor. His job would be to set the boundary lines between enormous properties, marking the best spots for roads to connect towns and generally mapping out the area. Incredibly busy from the start, Washington would spend the next 2 years mostly in the wilderness living off the land. This time toughened him both physically and mentally, and he became very familiar with the frontier. For the first time, he could see his life's path clearly laid out before him. He would find a woman to marry, and he would live his quiet life as a land surveyor. But in 1749, Lawrence Washington became ill and was soon diagnosed with tuberculosis. George immediately resigned from his job and they traveled to sunny Barbados, a warmer climate, in an attempt to help Lawrence recover. Sadly, within a year, Lawrence Washington, George's older brother and father figure, had died. In his will, Lawrence left George his entire estate. And as a testament to how much his older brother meant to him, Lawrence's portrait would always hang in George's private study for the rest of his life. Inspired by his late brother, George joined the Virginia militia in 1752, and he would quickly rise through the ranks due to his knowledge of the land and his noted bravery. In the early 1750s, tensions were rising between France and England, with over 2 million settlers now living in the colonies. The British had begun to look westward for land, just as the French in Canada had begun to move south with the exact same goal. It was here that Washington would first make a name for himself, for better and for worse. Washington volunteered for a dangerous mission as an emissary to the French forces. His duty was to deliver an ultimatum to the French, demanding that they leave the Ohio River area. After a month's trek through the wilderness, he finally arrived at their fort. But when they read the ultimatum, they refused, sending Washington back into horrible winter conditions. Day by day, Washington began the harrowing journey back to Virginia. He would arrive home 77 days after leaving, only delayed once because he fell into a frozen river, nearly drowning. But his journey wasn't wasted. News of his dedication spread quickly throughout the army, even reaching as far as England. Within 2 years, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, second in command over 300 men. In February of 1754, Washington was ordered with 150 men to reach the Ohio River before the French did and create a defensive position there. Had been no real conflict between the two nations up to this point, just tension. But the British nevertheless wanted to be ready. However, before even reaching the river, Washington was told by his Native American scouts that the French had beaten him to the Ohio River, and that a French force of about 50 men was camped close by. Washington decided that instead of sending this information up the flagpole, he would act on it himself. When his men reached the French camp, they fired, killing the men, including their leader. What Washington didn't realize was that this was a diplomatic envoy carrying only a message for the British. When the French found their men dead, they were outraged, and it was Washington that was to blame. What is truly mind-boggling about this is that this unprovoked violence by George Washington would begin the French-Indian War, which would in turn start the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that involved nearly every country in Europe. When his fellow soldiers learned what George Washington had done, they were furious, and they were clamoring for his resignation. He was young and rash, and not to be trusted. George would take the criticism to heart, but instead of resigning, he vowed to be better, to remain cool and calm under pressure. A year later in 1755, while traveling with Major General Braddock's group of 1,200 British forces, his men ran directly into an ambush. Almost 2/3 of his men were cut down by the combined French and Native American forces, including General Braddock. British soldiers began to panic and flee in every direction. In the chaos, Washington took command of his men that were still alive, organizing a tactical retreat and saving hundreds of men's lives. It's here that Washington developed his presence as a leader and as a commander. Over the next 3 years, Washington would be given command of nearly 1,000 men, and he would train them to become one of the best regiments in the colonies, defending nearly 300 miles of frontier from over 20 Native American attacks. But by 1758, Washington decided that he had had enough of war. Jaded by the constant infighting between officers, he resigned and he went home. Just a year later, Washington met and married a wealthy widow named Martha Dandridge Custis. She was an intelligent and graceful woman who had 2 children from her previous marriage. Although the marriage is not thought to have been a love match, George and Martha created a happy home for each other and her children. He loved them like his own, and is later seen to have tenderly signed off on letters to them as "your papa." Their union had made Washington into one of the wealthiest men in Virginia and added nearly 18,000 acres to his name. This garnered him the elite social status he had always been striving for. He would become friends with many other influential Virginians, hosting parties and balls at his estate in Mount Vernon, and be elected to the House of Burgesses. But even with all his accolades and social status, Washington noticed that the British still treated him like a second-class citizen, and others around the colony began to notice as well. In 1763, the British released a royal proclamation banning colonial settlers from moving west of the Allegheny Mountains, which was, to many colonial veterans of the French and Indian War, the sole reason the war had been fought in the first place. Now, the British had a financial motive for the ban. Their ultra-lucrative fur trade. Their wars had been expensive, and the colonists would be the ones to pay the price. Washington had seen hundreds of compatriots die during the French and Indian conflict, and he would not let their deaths be for nothing. Soon, Washington began to use his wealth and influence to organize protests and boycotts all over the colonies. But the punishment only fueled colonial outrage. Protests began to spread throughout the colonies, with some of them turning into full-out riots. British soldiers soon poured into American harbors by the hundreds, and even more acts would be passed aimed at controlling the colonists. By 1770, Washington could see the writing on the wall, so he reunited with his old Virginia regiment and began teaching military discipline. Everything boiled over on March 5th, 1770.
Bhailí slua Fargach timpeall grúpa CHÉAD UACHTARÁN. Thosaigh an slua ag masláthu ag caithfh líoróidí sneachta agus clocha de réir mar a bheas an slua cailínach níos mó agus níos mó, thosaigh na CHÉAD ag callach orm ag mothú go raibh a saol I máil in dáiríre. Thosaigh cloig ag seanam fut an bhaile ag tarrant níos mó agus níos mó daoine isteach sa slua, agus tháinig sé chun bheith ina uafás únglán sa bhascán agus sa iúnsaí fuaimú. Seap dhuine de na CHÉAD UACHTARÁN, gur cúla sé an fochail tinne, agus go lámhí sé a musca isteach sa slua. Lean a choglachacha CHÉAD go tape. A chréir ghlí na nuachtáin an bhaitindar ceann, an SLÉACHT BHOSTÚIN, do go leor cailínach, George Washington san áireamh, be an tú jearannach, dúintí na Breataine. Cúpla bliain ina dhiaidh sin, sa bhliain 1770 a trí ina chéad gníomh mór deireadh amach Athchruthuithe. Chaoi grúpa cailínach beagnach $1 billiún de há isteach I cían bhostún. Be an agad neamhmhareicnach ceann de phríún sapal. Bhí na cailínig buile faoin méid a bhí acánachorthú gach rud ó leathanig páipéir, go dtí an tá a bhí díreach scríostachu. Bhí siad ag soláthar méideanna ollamhóra airgid don bhreatain. Gan ionadaí amháin ina Parliament, bhí siad faoi thiamáint ag an athrá réalóideach. Gan camas, gan ionadaíocht is imimecht, íocámach. An Boston Tea Party. Pointse casadh is Staire Mheiriceánach. Anois bheas na Breataine, go raibh cailíneacht Massachusetts I ceannach Ungláán, agus rinne siad díoltas 3,000 trúpaí Breatainacha a cheoladh go Boston, chun an éigeamhsaíocht a cheamsú. Chur siad gríthe níos mó fós I bhéim anois, a dochtar na dlíthe intolerable, chun cailíneacht Massachusetts a fionsú. Acla go chláró rí séirse an tríú, go lua go raibh na cailíní go léir I ceamarc. Bhuel ionadaithe gach cailíneacht le chéile, agus bhunaigh siad an chomháil mhór ronne cuireadh Washington agus dhuine cosúil le Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, James Madison agus John Adams ortú freisin le chéile, díobh siad I rí séirse, a rís na dlíthe intolerable seo a bhaint, ag bagairt go gcuirfidís cosc gach airí Breataneacha itir an dá lín, hí mílistí fud na cailíneachtaí tasathe, ag ullethú iad féin don chocog maidin lua a nú láidéag Ebrán, 1775 lámhí I Lexington, Massachusetts. Díobh sé soléir cén taobh a lámhí dúis, ach dag an troid 8 saoidúirí Mheiriceánacha maraibh, le seo an lámhí a chuala timpeall an domhan, a thosaigh an cocog réalóideach ag an dara chomháil mhór ronne tocag Washington ina phríomhchanaisí an airm mór ronne nua, agus thocair siad an ainm na cailíní aontaithe thaisteal. Washington go Boston chun ceannas a lacha an airm nua, thosaigh siad léagar bhostún chun an chathair a gháil a ríis a bhí á rialú ag saoidúirí Breataneach anois. Nuair a tháinig an teirech, bhí Washington timpeallathe Boston, le 200 guní I raibh rua ag na Breataine, ach éalú ag críochnú an léagar, agus ag bronna bua mór na Mheiriceánaigh dúis. Thug an bua seo dóchas donna cailínig, chus sé an síal go raibh an cocúg seo faoi cheartas a bháin. Ní raibh sé faoi hiirse ón nGaorlanónt, agus sa deireadh an fun neamhspleachas umláin ón impaireacht na Breataine, an 4 úil, 1776. Glach an hoval mhór ráine leis an deireadh neamhspleachas den go, agus runnadh rialtas na Stát Aontaithe Mheirice go hofigiúil iad ilifíor a chruaitir catharam, agus tá siad faoi cheangal ag gruathtóir le roinnt ceart nach féidir a bhaint amach saol saoirse agus an páir san sonas, nuair a éiríonn éon uirm rialtas mílteach donna críocha seo. Tá sé de ceart ag an bopalé a athrú nó a chur ceall, agus rialtas nua a bhunú. An lá sin féin tháinig dachiad a 5 longamach ó cáiste nua éireach. Bhí airm na Breataine ais. Bhí Washington agus a cuid fearr ag luí isteach díreach trasna na habhain I Brooklyn. An drochuair bhí sé an seo go mbeadh na Mheiriceánaigh ag fulamt a géad de feet bhrúidil sa troid is mó den chogog a Dr. K. Bhaile Brooklyn Heights. Fiú a bháin in a chúrsáil lean na Breataine aig ag bólug fósaí Washington. Bhí na Mheiriceánaigh ais ag cunne an Hudson, gan éon bhealach amach, agus bhí an chumme an scéal go bhféadfadh an Réabhlóid Mheiriceánach a bheith thart sul róisí tasata in éireadh beagnach. Cosúil le míróid tháinig thio tíomh isteach ag ligean d'arm Washington, an Hudson a chrasnú agus éaló, ó scríos umláin mar sin féin hí na Breataine tar éis an nómas, a thaspáint cuireadh na mílte Mheiriceánach chun báis ná gágéad. Agus bhí ceannaireacht Washington á ceistú a ríis leis an airm mórráine, an imil titim hit an maráltocht go mór, thosaí díchréideúint ag fás agus ballú íorthóirí a tháinig chun neart an airm a Alánú. Ach fiú le lín an ama, mharcha seo, níor chail Washington riamh creideamh ina gúis, agus coní sé a cuidfear ag creideúnt. Go bhféadfadh seans a bheith acu fós sa gheimhridh 1770 a sé gheobh George Washington. An seans sin léirí Faisnéise go raibh airm na Breataine tar éis fille nua Eirc don gheimhridh ag fágáil fórsa beag amháin taobh thiar chun Trenton,
New Jersey, a cosan siap Washington ansa antas a athróid cuasa an cogaidhe, nálag trasnig Washington agus 2004 céad sagadúrí an abhainn Delaware éirithe, agus hiúd siad 9,000 tríd an bhóg tearamh go thomláin trí antas hí na fórsaí Breatainacha Measca ag ceiliúradh na nálag. Agus nuair a rinne ansaí orthu, níor chuir siad beagnach aon troid bun, buí an cath gan aon cáilteannas taobh Washington a bhócáin a dhéanamh an glúiseacht frátastúnach. Agus rinne pointe casadh an COGADH nuair a bhí gachród cáilte, bhí Washington fós I gceannas a arm I gcinne gach seans an bhliain. Dar gcionn, bhí an phrainn cinnte gur féidir leis na Meiriceánaigh a bheith ina gcógúlaí dlistanach I gcinne na impairteach na Breataine, agus rinne siad cógúlaíocht leo na Stát Aontaithe. Bhí an táide cogaí tar éis casadh Washington nach bhéadach an COGADH seo a bheith faoi na Breataine a thóirú go thomláin, ach iad a ciapag, go sa deireadh iad a ágáil nuair a chur fórsaí na Fráinc cos Mheiriceá. Bhí an COGADH beagnach thart an 9 dearg fómar, 1780 a haon géal an ginearál Breatainach Charles Cornwallis ag Yorktown de fórsaí cóceangailte Mheiriceá agus na Fráinc faoi ceannas George Washington agus Marquis de Lafayette. Ba é an géile ag Yorktown an cath suntasach dearannach I Mheiriceá. Tuaí aithníiad go feirmiúil neamhspláchas na Stát Aontaithe Mheiriceá le síniú conar ó fóras an trú man fómar, 1783, agus leis an gogad thart deireadh, bhí Washington sásta leis an saol a bhí caite aige. Bhí sé ag troid san cruthú Mheiriceá, agus bhí sé deongháilte éirí as a ostáit ais sa bhaile I Virginia. Ní amháin gur éirí mé as gach fostaíocht fiblí, ach tá mé ag éirí as ionam féin. Bogfaí mé go raibh síos shrúna beatha go dtí go múlan mé le maracha. Ach ní raibh a thiacáin le bheith thart thar na 4 bliana amach rón, rinne an náisiún a codí Washington le tógáil iireachta. Dhéanamh a ceannacht a fáil le foirníochtaí politiúla ó gach ceann dá stáit I ggéalamh go mbeadh sé mar a heastaí uaite. Ach nuair a thosaigh sé ag bheith faoi bhagairt ag an anarchaí agus ag an éirí amach, ní raibh ach fer amháin riamh a déafaí a antú chun iad a threoradh sa bhliain 1780 a né tothg George Washington déan chu chun a bheith ina CHÉAD UACHTARÁN na Stát Aontaithe Mheiriceá. Churfadh sé an bailach bun, do chat a chéalaí sé a bheith I do Uachtarán. Bhí sé tuiscinach go raibh an chéad duine a líon an ról, agus dá bhrí sin go mbeadh sé an caitheáin maidir le conas ba chúr d'Uachtarán sa tóchaí gníomhú. Rialaí sé mar an fear smainteach a bhí aige. Bhí sé ag cur sampla de chatruime díanat agus neamhtracht taithléireachta bún. Bhunaigh Washington an críat náisiún ag líana a chóhéil chomhlóirí le fíor-thástáil, ag bunú cé a bheith I ceammas an gúirt uachtarach, agus ag cruthú an chéad bhanc náisiúnta an fíor-eiseamlár dheathar bunatach. Bhí Washington I ceammas ar náisiún trína óga, agus níor ág sé ifig go dtí go bheithí sé go raibh sé sa bháilte I náiríre sa bhliain 1790, a 7 tar éis 8 mbliana. In ifig dearadh George Washington as deireadh anois ag fáil na síochána a bhí á larg aice le blianta.
bhrón sé a chuid ama ar a healach agus ar a heach. I ró ach 2 bhliain ina dhiar sin sa ghéimre 1700. Géad nácha a ní fuair Washington slagán a rinneadh níos measa de réir mar a chuaigh na léitheanta thart ar an 4 Fuair George Washington bás le Martha ar a thaobh ar dús, sa chogug ar dús sa tíorchán, agus ar dús I gríthe a chóseoramach. Tá sé deacair a thuiscint I náríre, cé cho tábhachtach is atá Washington an Canada ar an gcéad réabhlóid rathúil I coinne impaireacht chalínach ídal do fíor-mhóra, cosúil le Abraham Lincoln. Tá sé ina thiombal lonrach de thiairse ar fud an domhan na Stát Aontaithe Mheirice. Idreacht íor, Washington príne. Fás, tá sé ag ciairí a dhícheal a dhéanamh a chasadh. Leanúint le milliún dhuine ar fud an domhan, fós agléach ar an náisiún is mó ar domhan. Mar sin cén chuime a bhí ar CHÉAD UACHTARÁN Mheirice I náisiúide, cé go bhfuil go leor páirtráide againn de George Washington úntasach is beag ceann a cruthaí ó héal hí Washington go folasach, ag fuad si le haidh páirtráidí ag smíineh go 3,000 ama a bhí únta. Agus ar an gcús seo tá go leor íomhanna a eicimid de inniu cópaine. Ar ábhraí an saol sa bhliain 1700, géad 8 nuair a bhí Washington cuaige a 3 bliana d'aois. Thug an dealamh-mhór France Jean-Antoine Houdon cuairstead ag Athchruthuithe Mount Vernon. Be mission Houdon a ghlacha le measc beo caithfí pláistir dathaigh Washington a úsáifíonn sin chun céipeanna dealamh ufigiúla a chruthú. Úsáideadh an measc beo chun an rud ar a tógtar cosúlacht ufigiúil. Washington a dhealapú an dealamh seo ar bhéit an saol atá suite I Parliament Stáit Virginia. Bunathe ar chur síos fisiciúil ón a héal ní héin omaché go raibh George Washington ina dhuine de phríomhphointí ag seasamh os cionn sé troid ar áirde bheith sé ar an bhéir is áirde I bhformhór na seanraí. A thiúil sé isteach in deara scríbhneoir sa bhliain 1700. Géad nácha dúirte nach raibh gá a ainm a ógart nuair a thiúil sé isteach I seomra, bhí a is a gach duine láithreach cé a bhí ann. Ach a bháin trína chumme, uatúil bró, trom tharathúla, gorma, giala, socrata, gedangan agus srón rómánach, beagán mór de réir cur síos, bhí sé I gcónaí galanta agus ginneitiúil. Uaireanta bhí cuma go raibh sé ag smaoineamh go domhan, ach bhí a charm ollamhór freisin. Bhí a réim thar a bheith tarantach 3 aonse, gan ainm tá roinnt míotais speisiúla faoi chuma Washington, a domhan ar rallach éigean go dtí an lá atá aniu ann, is sé an céad cheann, gur bhain sé úsáid as fiacla amat. Bhí fiacla ag Washington sna blianta déanacha, dá héal, achas dácha gur déanta as arach a bhí siad, tháinig an bhíotais gur amat a bhí iontu sna 1800. Béidir toisc go mbíonn fiacla arach a néasca a staniu 1400 eile. Is é gur bhain Washington gruaigh bhean a gcónaí ná go raibh wigi in deara, ní cha sé wigi riamh ag róniu a gruaigh nádúirta stílathe de réir an ama agus uaireanta. Cuireadh sé púdar chun bán a bhaintseamach. Is féidir leat a fheiceáil I portráidí de Washington níos óga go bhfuil a chuid gruaige nádúirta don rua, tá cop dealamh de chuid Houdon
de George Washington. Úsáiste agam is mo Athchruthuithe, mar sin féchamis an gume a bhí CHÉAD UACHTARÁN Mheiriceánach in deara inis. Go raibh maith agat